Continuing with the appendicular skeleton, what we're going to look at next is the upper limb. So we're going to look at the humerus, ulna, radius, as well as the hand, which includes the carpals, metacarpals, and phalanges. So you can see here, we've got the humerus, which is the top portion of your arm. It's going to have that ball and socket joint when the head articulates with the scapula. Then we're going to have the ulna and the radius. And when you are in anatomic position, the radius is always going to be the lateral bone and the ulna will be the medial bone. So the radius is the one that's going to be closer to where your thumb is when your hand is open. We also are going to take a look at the hand. So we've got the carpals, which are your wrist bones. Then the palm of your hand is made of your metacarpals, and then your finger bones are called phalanges. Let's take a look at them in 3D. So starting here with the humerus, we're going to go ahead and isolate that humerus and look at some of its features. So first, you'll notice it has a nice round head. Directly below the head, you have what's called the anatomic neck. And then below that, you have what's called the surgical neck. So it's got two different necks. It's going to have two large protuberances, and these two large bumps are called tubercles. So the larger one is called the greater tubercle, and then the smaller one is called the lesser tubercle. So the lesser tubercle is on the anterior portion facing forward. The main portion of the bone is just called the shaft. And then there is a bumpy region right here, which is called the deltoid tuberosity. That's an attachment point for your deltoid muscle. Then down here, what we're going to see the articulations for the elbow. So there's two portions right here. The first portion is called the trochlea, and the second portion is called the capitulum. The trochlea is going to be basically the portion that connects to the ulna. So the ulna has a part that looks kind of like a little mouth, and the mouth is biting onto this trochlea. Then the front portion of the mouth is going to be fitting into this little fossa called the coronoid fossa, while the back portion of the mouth is going to be biting into this back little fossa called the olecranon fossa. Okay, so the ulna is biting around that whole part of the humerus. Then next to the ulna, we would have the radius. So the radius would actually articulate with this portion, and so there is a little bit of a radial fossa right there. And then on either side, we do have what's called epicondyles. So we have a medial epicondyle and a lateral epicondyle. And that takes care of the humerus. So now let's look at those matching portions on the ulna. So as I mentioned, it looks like it has well, there's a shaft in the middle, but it looks like it has a little mouth portion right at the top, like it's biting. And that inner portion of the mouth is called the trochlear notch. So that makes sense because the trochlear notch articulates with the trochlea. Then this large bumpy region here, the olecranon or olecranon process is what fit into that fossa. And then the little guy right here is called the coronoid process, which fits into that fossa. Have a slight facet right here. This is called the radial notch. That's because the head of the radius articulates here. And then at the bottom portion, what you have is what's called the head of the ulna, as well as this little pointy region, which is called a styloid process. So there's several pointy things like this called styloid processes throughout the skeleton. We've seen it previously, but it will be a part of the bump on the side of your wrist. So you can actually feel this. Now let's take a look at that radius. And notice that the radius also has a little pointy region on the opposite side. So this is also called a styloid process, but this is the styloid process of the radius. The main portion, again, is just called the shaft, and this top portion is called the head. Directly below the head, we have the neck, and then this portion is just called a tubercle. Okay. I just wanted to add that this is also referred to as a radial tuberosity, and what it is it's basically an attachment point for that biceps. Then down here, there's going to be a little articular area for the ulnar notch. So that's because the ulna and the radius do articulate in two portions at the top and then down there at the bottom. Now let's move on to the hand. So for that portion, let's take a look here. So starting with the fingers, we number them 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Of course, number 1 being the thumb. And you have 3 phalanxes. So each individual bone is called a phalanx. If you click on that, you can see it's called a phalanx. Together, they're called phalanges. And because there's 3, there's going to be the distal one, which is the furthest away. There's going to be the proximal one, which is closer. This is the proximal one. And then there's going to be the middle one, which is in between. So they're all named the same thing, distal, proximal, and middle, but with the numbers. And then the thumb only has 2, so that one will just have distal and proximal with no middle. Then for the portion that makes up the palm, those are called the metacarpals, but they follow the same numbering rule, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then to get into those wrist bones, we're going to have to remove some ligaments. So for the wrist bones, you do have to clear out quite a few ligaments to get in there, but what you're going to see is there are 8 of them. And so it can be quite challenging to remember these. There are several mnemonic devices you can use to remember them in order. So the order that I usually go in is from anterior view. We start with the ones that are more proximal. Okay, so scaphoid, followed by lunate, followed by triquetral, then this tiny one, pisiform, then moving to the second row, trapezium, trapezoid, capitate, and finally hamate. So again, there's 8. There's sort of 4 in the bottom row and 4 in the top row. However, if you flip it to the posterior view, you will never be able to see this little guy. So you can't see pisiform from the back, but then you could also identify them from the back. So just pick a mnemonic device that you like and then learn them in that order. It's the easiest way to do this one. So that takes care of the arm. And then we're going to move on to the leg. So you're going to see a lot of similarities between the arm and the leg. You have one large bone for the top portion of the leg. That's going to be the femur, and it has several protuberances similar to what we saw with the humerus. Then we have 2 bones for the lower leg, just like we saw with the lower forearm. And then one major difference is that the elbow joint doesn't have anything else going on, while the knee joint does have this additional bone, which is the patella. Then when you get down to the feet, you'll see that the toes follow the same exact rules as the fingers do. They are called phalanges and they have the same numbering rules. We also have what's called tarsals and metatarsals. So in the hand, we had carpals and metacarpals. In the foot, we have tarsals and metatarsals. Again, very similar rules. The main difference, we only have 7 tarsals rather than 8, like we saw with the carpals. So let's take a look at these guys in 3D. So taking a look at the legs, let's first isolate this femur. And we've got a lot of similar features. We do have the head of the femur followed by the neck directly below it. And then we do have 2 large bumps right here. The larger bump is called the greater trochanter. And then the smaller bump is called the lesser trochanter. And then in between them, we have what is called the intertrochanteric crest. So those are, of course, attachment points to various muscles. And then down here, we just have the shaft. See over here, gluteal tuberosity, that's where the gluteus muscle attaches. In the back, we also have something called the linea aspera. Notice a ton of different muscles attached to that part. Oops. Okay, so this is from posterior view, by the way. So this is posterior view. In posterior view, we also have this region called the popliteal surface. So the popliteal is basically the back of the knee, kind of like your knee pit. Then we have some lines here, which I don't think you need to know those, but we do need to know the condyles down here. Okay, so medial condyle, lateral condyle, that's because this is a right femur and we're looking at it from posterior view. And then in between them, there's an intercondylar fossa. We do have epicondyles as well. So there's your medial epicondyle on that side and your lateral epicondyle on that side. Then if we switch to the front, one other feature here is the patellar surface. That's because the patella bone does exist, of course, as part of the knee joint. I think that's everything. There might be one little other portion here. So it's not named, but there is a little groove here, a little hole that's called the fovea. It's just another place where a ligament can help keep this joint connected to the acetabulum of the os coxa. So that's your femur. Now let's move on to lower leg. Fibula has a lot less, so let's look at that one first. So fibula, not much going on, honestly, other than the shaft. The top, you have a head, and then over here, if you look kind of carefully at that portion, you have what's called the malleolus. Okay, so the lateral malleolus, that's a bump on the side of your ankle that you can feel. And you'll see there's a malleolus on the tibia as well. So with the two large bumps kind of on the side of the ankle, this one was the lateral malleolus, and this one will be the medial malleolus that you'll see in just a bit. So for tibia, as I mentioned, this portion is called the medial malleolus. So those are homologous to what we saw with the styloid processes up in the arm region. We do have, of course, the shaft. And then at the top, we have several other interesting features. We have a very large bump here called the tibial tuberosity, and that is where the patellar ligament is going to attach. So that kind of holds the patella in place. We also have the lateral and medial condyles. So those are going to be the articular surfaces that match up with the femur. Then this bumpy region right here is called the Intercondylar Eminence. And there is, well, we probably don't need to know the middle portion, but right there, do you know the eminence? And then one more region right here, that is called the region that articulates with the fibula, right? So that's the fibular notch. And there are some other things here, some various lines. Those are just different places where there's attachments of ligaments or muscles. So now zooming down onto the feet, as I mentioned before, the phalanges follow the exact same rules that we saw before. So this one right here is number 1. We've got proximal and distal phalanx. Notice it is also called the hallux. So the hallux is the name of the big toe, just a special name for it. And then we have our distal, medial, and proximal phalanx or phalanges. Then we have our metatarsals here, also numbered 1 through 5. Now to get over to those ankle bones, I'm going to have to remove some of these ligaments. The largest of the tarsals, and therefore the easiest to remember, is back here. That is called the calcaneus. So that's your large heel bone. It is also connected to the Achilles tendon, which is not on here. They didn't show it, but you've probably heard of that one. It's attached to your calf muscle. The next largest is called the talus, and the talus is the one that physically articulates with the tibia directly above it. So the talus is the only ankle bone that actually touches the tibia. That's where the bending of the ankle occurs. But then behind it, we have the calcaneus, which was your heel. In the front, we have several small ones that have similar names. So these guys are called cuneiform. We have the medial, intermediate, and lateral cuneiform. So that's 3 in a row. Then next to them, we have cuboid. And then between the talus and the cuneiform, we have what's called the navicular. So 7 total, 1 less than what we saw for the wrist. Okay, and that does take care of the leg, and therefore we are done with appendicular skeleton.